Today I'm very happy to have with me Professor Mary-Jane Rubenstein from Wesleyan University. She's an expert in many things, but in particular today we're going to talk about the multiverse from a more religious and historical perspective. Okay, Mary-Jane, welcome.
Thank you.
And so why don't you start by giving us a very broad perspective on what does the multiverse even mean?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think broadly we can use the term multiverse to signify the hypothesis that everything we can see, wherever we are in history, everything we can see is just one little part of a vast compendium of a whole bunch of other things that we could see if we were in that place, right? So you can use the multiverse as a term across history to refer to the hypothesis that there are many other worlds elsewhere.
And this is a very old idea, right? So do you have an idea of when did it more or less start?
Yeah, sure. Well, so it depends on where you're looking globally. Hindu cosmology has this notion that the world goes through periodic cycles of generation and degeneration. And that dates back just millennia. So you have a kind of cyclical multiverse where the universe gets sort of regenerated from time to time. Buddhist cosmologies also have notions of an infinite number of worlds sort of spatially arranged. Sometimes they're hierarchically arranged, sometimes they're sort of out there in space more horizontally. And it seems that that kind of Buddhist cosmology, that many worlds Buddhist cosmology, was in conversation with a trend of Greek philosophy that begins in about the 5th, maybe 6th century BCE, which is known as atomism. It seems like the ancient atomists were in actually conversation with ancient Indian philosophers, which is really interesting. And what the ancient atomists said was that our whole world, our cosmos is the word in Greek, our whole world is just one of an infinite number of other worlds. Some of these worlds are just like ours, some of them are totally different from ours, and they're just randomly generated through the collision of atoms.
Okay, so from what you're saying, there are kind of two different ways of thinking about the multiverse. You have like a multiverse in time.
Yeah.
Which basically means there is one universe that's sort of like a phoenix universe that is born, does its thing, dies, is reborn, and keeps doing that forever and ever in a sort of a cyclic universe style. And then you have another one where you have a spread out in space kind of multiverse, right? And these two ideas seem to have coexisted in the past.
Sure. So ancient Greece is an example of this in about the 5th century BCE. So we're talking about 2,500 years ago. Right. We have two rival multiverses. One is primarily spatial. This is the multiverse of the atomists. So we've got our world here and then other worlds beyond it, ad infinitum, they just go on for infinity. And then we had the Stoics, who were their rivals. The Stoics and the Atomists really hated each other. They had two different schools, nobody talked to each other. And the Stoics said, no, actually, it's not the case that there are many worlds in an infinite universe. There's just one world. The world is the universe. The world and the universe are the same thing. There's just one. But every once in a while, the sun bakes the earth to such an extent that the earth sets on fire, and the whole earth is absolutely destroyed and reduced to almost nothing and just totally destroyed. But there's like a little bit of a sort of moist principle and a little bit of a dry principle, and these two things interact and they eventually create a whole new world. Wow. So that's this sort of cyclical idea. So exactly, I think that the two basic models are the sort of spatial plurality on the one hand and the cyclical temporal plurality on the other hand.
This Stoic idea is really awesome because if you think about it, that's what's going to happen. In about 5 billion years, the sun is going to become a red giant. It's going to expand. It is going to scorch the earth, make it into basically cosmic dust. And that is the end of our solar system as we know it. But at the same time, when stars die, they sort of prompt the creation of new ones.
Right, that's where we get our heavy elements from, right? So
So
they were onto something.
They were onto something, yeah. Now, there seems that the word worlds is used in confusing ways here, right? So maybe you can kind of disentangle those uses a little
Sure.
bit.
So in the Greek language, the word for world is cosmos. And the word, they didn't really have a word for universe. They would call it all that is, or topon, the whole. So for the atomists, you could say there were a lot of different cosmoi, lots of different worlds, in topon, in the whole. For the Stoics, though, they said this cosmos, this world, is topon, is all that is. It totally depends on which model you're going for, whether there are a lot of worlds in the universe or whether the universe and the world are the same thing.
And then as we move in time, right, I mean, we get away from the pre-Socratics and go into Plato and Aristotle, and then somehow these ideas are appropriated by the Christian church.
Yeah.
So how does that transition go, and does the concept of the multiverse survive this transition?
Yeah, it doesn't go well for the multiverse. I mean, not for a while. So both Plato and Aristotle were very concerned to insist that there was only one world, only one cosmos in the entire universe. And they set forth these proofs in really different ways. But Plato first insisted, nope, just one world in the universe. And also, so against the atomists, he was saying, there's only one world in the universe and that's it. But against the Stoics, he was also saying, and it will endure forever. It will never be destroyed. This is it. This is just the way it is. Plato told it in the Timaeus more as a kind of creation narrative about a benevolent God who was sort of creating and preserving this world. Aristotle has more physical proofs based on the movement of elements and things like that. He argues that similarly, there's only one world in the universe, and it's going to exist forever. It has existed for Aristotle eternally, and it will continue to exist eternally. So Plato and Aristotle really dismantle those multiverse cosmologies of the atomists and the Stoics. And then, right, as we get the sort of rise, this is telling this sort of story in a Western context, as we get the rise of Christian philosophy in the late Antique and Middle Ages, they similarly argue against both the atomists or Epicureans and the Stoics that God only made one universe, or one world, right? And that this is the only world in the universe. It's very important for those authors to tie the singularity of the world with the singularity of God. For them, since God is one, the world has to be one. Like if there were many worlds, somehow there would maybe be many gods or something like that. So there's this.
Is there a moment in history where there is a transition where they say, wait, but if God is infinitely powerful, why would he, I guess, limit himself to creating just a single world?
Yes. I mean, there are a number of transitions where this realization comes and then it gets squelched and then it comes and then it gets squelched. The first time is right after, so Thomas Aquinas was the last great defender of a singular, absolutely singular cosmos overseen by a singular God. Thomas Aquinas dies, and a couple years later, this condemnation comes out saying, wait, actually, it's insulting to say that an infinite God could only create one universe, right? If God is truly infinite, God would have to be able to create an infinite number of worlds, or even an infinite number of universes, depending how we're using these terms. So an infinite God would have to create an infinite creation. And so they basically condemn Thomas Aquinas after he's dead, right? So it's a good thing he's not living because he doesn't have to deal with this. And so then after Thomas, centuries of scholastic philosophers start saying, okay, so we have to say that an infinite God could have created an infinite number of worlds, but we look around and we don't see an infinite number of worlds. Therefore, they started arguing, an infinite God could create an infinite number of worlds, but he hasn't. That's the sort of compromise in the late medieval period. This all gets broken apart a little bit, pretty profoundly, by Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century, who argues very radically, actually, that the universe has to be infinite. Universe has to be infinite, because what he realizes is, and he basically anticipates the principle of special relativity, what he realizes is that actually nothing in the world is standing still, nothing at all. And that wherever you are, it looks like you're standing still and everything else is moving around you. He apparently got this vision when he was on a boat, and he felt like he was standing still, and it felt like the waters were rushing by him, even though, right? So he realizes that this must be the way that the stars work as well, that actually you could be on any star or any planet out there and say, look, I'm standing still and everything else is moving around me. And so from that realization, he realized that if everything is in motion all the time, then nothing is at the center of anything. Therefore, the universe has to be infinite because it has no center. So that's the way he got to this reasoning, right? And then he began to say, he used the term boundless instead of infinite. He reserved the term infinite for God. And an infinite creator, he said, would have to create a boundless universe. This idea then gets resurrected about 150 years later by Giordano Bruno, whom you have probably heard about, who infamously gets executed in the year 1600, in part for this teaching. Giordano Bruno absolutely said very straightforwardly, an infinite God could create nothing less than an infinite universe. An infinite universe filled with an infinite number of worlds. This was Bruno's big idea. Bruno had actually rediscovered Lucretius, who was an atomist philosopher of the about 2nd, 3rd century CE. So he had actually retrieved the atomists. That's basically where he got this idea.
Right. It's interesting because Einstein kind of revisits Cous's universe in a sense, because when he first proposes his model of the universe in 1917, he says, I want a universe which is finite but boundless. So the universe is like on the surface of a sphere, if you think about it, because a sphere doesn't have a beginning, it doesn't have an end, the surface of a ball, right? And so it's boundless, but it's finite. I mean, if you go on a trajectory around, you're going to get back to where you started from, right? So he says the most perfect universe, super Platonist there, right, is a universe which is spherically symmetric and boundless for that reason. And that's kind of interesting because when people ask, but wait, the Big Bang, right? The Big Bang is an explosion. People have this notion. And they say, oh, it's an explosion, but if it's an explosion, where is the center of the universe? And we say, no, it's not like that, right? Because every point is the center of an explosion. And so if you are sitting on a galaxy, like our galaxy, and you're looking out, you're going to see everybody moving away from you. But if you move to another galaxy, you're also going to see people moving away from you, like the expansion of the Earth. So in a sense, it's very, very similar, at least conceptually, to this notion. And then we move on to the modern versions of the multiverse, right? I mean, so here we are apparently rediscovering some old knowledge here and dressing it with the language of modern science. So how do you position, the modern ideas of multiverse, in this historical/religious context?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because, of course, the Einsteinian notion, which was hearkening back to people like Cuse and Bruno, seemed at least to get displaced by the triumph of the Big Bang hypothesis in 1965, right? It seemed like what you had then was a universe that actually began, right? That was not eternal as Einstein had hoped, but that began somewhere, and so that was in that sense finite, at least temporally finite. It had a birth, yeah, exactly. Right. And Christian theologians were very excited about this because they were saying that looks a lot like the story we've been telling, right? We've been telling the story about how there was nothing, and then there was a big flash of light, and then there was a whole bunch of stuff, right? That looks just like what we've been saying.
Right.
So these stories sort of toggle back and forth as we move on through the centuries. What goes on in the late 20th century is that the notion that there might be many universes other than this one starts emerging from all kinds of different places in physics. In the late 60s, it starts coming out of quantum mechanics with the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. In the late 80s, it starts emerging out of developing inflationary cosmology. In the early 2000s, it starts emerging out of developments in string theory. So all of these different physicists are somehow colliding with multiverses. What's striking to me, though, is that the notion of multiple universes was a really fringe idea and not taken very seriously until fairly recently. It seems like it's only about a decade that it's been a kind of respectable, possible scientific hypothesis. And we can talk about why this may be the case. But part of the reason that the multiverse gets so much sort of sudden attention and suddenly looks like it might actually be viable, I think, is that it looks like it provides a good alternate interpretation for fine-tuning, right?
What's that?
Right, so the idea is that the more physicists learn about the fundamental configuration of our universe, the more it seems that if any of the constants of nature were any different than it is, we wouldn't be able to have a universe at all. Right. Specifically not one filled with stars that birth elements that give us planets and that give us things like this. So, if gravity were any stronger, planets couldn't stay in orbit around the sun. They would just sort of collapse into the sun, and we would all be sort of being crushed under the force of gravity. So it seems like everything has to be just right in order to get the kind of world that we have.
It's the Goldilocks universe.
Goldilocks principle, right? This one is just right, and I've got a universe. So the question is, like, how did each of these constants, the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force, gravity, the cosmological constant, the mass of the electron, like, how did all these get precisely to the value they need to be so that we could get the kind of universe we have? And just, strictly philosophically speaking, the easiest answer is, well, somebody must have done it. Like, somebody must have set each of these constants just right to give us this kind of universe. What the multiverse does is it gives you an alternative explanation. It says, well, look, if universes are being generated all the time, then those universes could each try on different values. You could have a universe with a whole lot of gravity and a universe with a whole lot of cosmological constants. And for the ones that wouldn't support life just wouldn't work out, right? But every once in a while, a universe will have the right combination of constants that it needs to give us a universe filled with stars. And we seem to be in one of those universes.
So is that why this British astrophysicist Bernard Carr says, if you don't want a God, you better have a multiverse?
Yeah, I think this is just what he means, that you can either explain the fine-tunings through something like an extra cosmic creator, or you can explain the fine-tunings through infinity and accident, which is what the multiverse gives us. And so to answer your question about the historical legacy of ancient multiverse cosmologies, this is exactly what the atomists were up against 2,500 years ago when they were saying there are an infinite number of worlds. What they were trying to do was to displace what they called superstitio, religion as superstition, the notion that our world was created for us by benevolent gods. They were worried about this idea. They thought that it caused people to act terribly, to make human sacrifices, to believe silly things. And so their whole effort was to displace that idea that there were creators by saying, no, there's not a creator, there are actually infinite worlds instead, and they're generated accidentally. So you get that same sort of philosophical problem resurrecting itself.
So they were the atomists, in a sense, were the first hardcore atheists.
So technically they weren't atheists. They were functional atheists. They did believe in gods. They taught that there were gods, but that the gods were sort of enlightened cosmic sages who lived.
They didn't care about this
They didn't
stuff.
care. They were they were blissed out. They were contemplating the eternal truths. And why would they mess with us? I mean,
they wouldn't get their hands dirty with the world.
Precisely. Yeah. They just sort of lived on far off worlds, just kind of.
Right.
Contemplating things.
Some people say that about theoretical physicists as opposed to experimental physicists. No, we don't get our hands dirty. Exactly. The experimental guys are the ones that measure. Yeah. In fact, they're the ones that measure the constants of nature, right? And it's sort of a funny historical quirk to consider, as people are considering now, that these constants of nature have some sort of deeper cosmic significance, as opposed to just being what they are because our universe works the way it does. Yeah. So it's sort of creating a question, right. Where do these cosmological the constants of nature, including the cosmological constant, that basically tells you how fast the universe is expanding right now. If there is some sort of uber theory out there that could explain those things. Right? Yeah,
it seems to me, I'd love to know what you think about this, but it seems to me that that's where the boundary is between physics and metaphysics. That physics says, okay, these are the constants. How do they work and what can we do with them, right? And how do they make things go, right? How do they make things go this way, all the rest of it? But the question, why are these constants the way they are, seems to me to be a metaphysical question.
Right.
The why, I think, is a metaphysical question, which doesn't mean physicists ought not to be doing it. It's just that I think that is the point at which the only answers you can get to that why question become seem like they're maybe on the borders, on the edges of what counts as physics, right? That those answers, whether it's God, whether it's a multiverse, whether it's are going to be extra cosmic principles. And physics, by definition, works on intracosmic principles. So that seems, I don't know if you...
No, I think that's exactly right. It, in a sense, by asking these questions about the origins of the constants of nature, we're sort of trying to elevate physics into a explanatory theory that explains itself. Right. And that's sort of a hardcore thing to do, you know, and it's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, I can see the temptation because, you know, after all, the dream of physics is to explain as much as we can of the world. Right. So in a sense, it's following that tradition. You know, we want to know everything there is to know, right? Yeah. But I think it's sort of stepping ahead of its own conceptual framework, in a sense that maybe physics is just not prepared to do it. And by creating these theories, in particular the multiverse theory, that has a whole debate about it, where can you actually even test this theory, you know, in a observational way to make sure the multiverse exists. And you know, you can push things really hard to make some tests, which are like, you know, if two universes collided, you'd have some signature. What would you have? Right. But honestly, you know, those are very vague hypotheses. And more than that, they assume a whole lot of physics in order to create those collisions between universes. It means that if this other universe existed and it was expanding and collided with us, the physics there would have to be very close to the physics here, because we would have to be using similar principles. Right. For example, the speed of light and other things. Yeah. So it's kind of like, it's our almost like us kind of thing universe, you know, a bizarro universe. Yeah, and I think that's actually, for somebody like me, a very familiar move, right? The problem for cosmology, I think, unlike any other science, is that it is irretrievably and inescapably inside the thing it's trying to study, right? Any other science can get outside the thing it's trying to study and then look at it from the outside and say, oh, I understand, I can see it as a whole. The problem for cosmology, of course, is that we're inside the thing that we're trying to understand, and so that our perspective is necessarily bound by that insidedness. Whether our telescopes are up on mountains or even on satellites and balloons, wherever they are, we're still inside the universe. Right. And so any kind of attempt to explain what it was that gave rise to our universe, or whether there's something beyond it, whether there's some sort of extra cosmic generating principle that gives rise to universes, is going to require that we take the laws and the phenomena that we observe inside the universe and project them outside the universe and say they must obtain there too, right? They must take place there too. They must also be at work there too. So the multiverse, for example, would have to obey quantum field theory. Yeah. Who knows, right? Yeah. Who knows? But these are assumptions that we make. And again, for somebody who studies religion, this is a move that theologians have done for millennia, to say the deity or deities that gave rise to our world look in some way like us. Right? That they have traits that we are familiar with. Either they're conscious, or they're reproductive, or they're vegetal, or whatever they are. But they all require you to take something that we observe inside the universe and then ascribe it to the author of the universe. And we just have no idea. Yeah, it sounds almost like the idea of archetypes, you know, that there are only certain ways in which we can think about questions of origins. Yeah. And we just can't go far enough to actually step out and look at the picture from the outside in, right? And it's similar, as we'll see in this course, we look at that in quantum mechanics, we have something similar where an observer cannot really be separated from what's being observed. Right. And of course, in the end of the course, we talk about consciousness, which is a very similar problem. How do we step out of our heads to understand our head? Right? So it's kind of a similar problem, right? So I wanted to ask you one final question, and it may or may not be related to the multiverse, you can tell me, but it sounds to me that one of the things that trips us a lot as humans when we kind of ask these questions is what can be generally called the problem of the first cause. What caused the cause that caused everything else, right? And of course, Aristotle, for example, he came up with some idea that there was this unmoved mover thing, there was some kind of deity that did it, but that's cheating in a sense, because he's already saying that I'm violating all the laws that I'm using inside the universe to create this thing. And that seems to me a very religious viewpoint, that there is an absolute power beyond the laws of nature. And it seems to me that the multiverse is kind of just us being stuck again with the issue of the first cause. You know, how does our universe start? Well, there is some universe generating entity out there that creates this, and then you go, okay, but then how do you create that one? And it turtles all the way down.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's this line from a Molière play where somebody asks a doctor, what is it about this tonic that makes me so sleepy? And the doctor says, oh, it's a sleepy making property, right? It's just it's just a name for the function that it's serving.
Exactly.
And so that does seem to be the game that we're stuck in, and you can keep sort of pushing back the first cause back farther and farther, but then you can always do what a 5-year-old does and say, well, what caused that cause, right? I mean, whenever you give an explanation to a 5-year-old, the person will say, well, why that, right? And that why question can keep getting pushed farther and farther back. So I do think it's, sure, you could call it a religious imperative to kind of get back to the first cause. But it seems to me a specifically Western religious imperative to get back to the first cause. There are all sorts of non-monotheistic cosmologies that don't have a problem with just saying, like, yeah, the causes just keep going back forever. There is no, you don't get to a first. There's no first. But this insistence on the one and the first, and this is something that you've written a fair amount about, is a particularly monotheistic inheritance, that there has to be an unmoved, self-caused first thing in order to get everything going. We have a hard time, I think, in Western philosophies and theologies and science abiding the notion that it could be that the chain just goes back and branches out forever, and we're not going to get to a first thing, and we're not going to get to a final thing.
Right. So it's sort of like the multiverse is, in a sense, an expression of monotheistic science.
Might be. Depends on what kind of multiverse.
Yeah.
Probably depends on what kind of multiverse.
Yeah. Great. I think that does it for us. Thank you so much, Mary-Jane. That was awesome.
It's great to talk to you. Thanks.
Okay.